If you've only seen the first part, you haven't seen the best part. The adventure continues in Superman 2.
Hello everybody, I'm Brevin Thompson.
And I'm Cameron Simpson.
And welcome back to my channel, and as promised, we're here to talk about Superman 2. When it comes to talking about Superman 2, you often hear about the theatrical cut or the Richard Donner cut. For this experience, we decided to have a project that would technically be split into two parts. Technically a cut comparison. One for the original theatrical cut, which was directed by Richard Lester, and of course the Richard Donner cut, which my preference, I prefer the Richard Donner cut because I like seeing what Donner originally intended for the sequel, especially with the material with Marlon Brando, which I think like a lot of us Superman fans were mostly invested in, and especially when it came to the first Superman. But when it came to Superman 2, when I first watched the movie as a whole as a kid, when I watched the theatrical version, I was first aware of the sequel when I first watched it on HBO, I think when I was about 8 years old. And I was a fan of Superman at the time, and I didn't know that the original movie had a sequel. I was just like, whoa, this was, it was actually a really enjoyable experience. And plus, it was very satisfying to see Superman actually fight somebody, in this case, General Zod and his cronies, Ursa and Non, who we seen briefly in the first movie getting sent off into the Phantom Zone. But it just delivers what you would want from a Superman sequel, given that it came out in the early 80s. But given what they managed to achieve at the time, it delivered a very satisfying sequel, and there's very few sequels that manage to be as good as the original. It's not as perfect as the original Richard Donner classic, but it's damn near close in my personal opinion. So, what would your take be on Superman 2?
Well, for one thing, I definitely agree that when it comes to Superman 2 in general, it really delivers as a sequel to the original. But for me, the first time I ever really saw it, I think a friend of mine gave me a copy to borrow so I could check it out. And honestly, I was amazed, really. It's my personal favorite of all the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, and I was just amazed by how good it turned out to be, really.
Now, when it comes to the opening titles, they use clips from the first movie as sort of a recap. And how Ken Thorne adapts John Williams' music? I mean, he does a good job regardless, but I like how Sam Raimi kind of use this as kind of inspiration for how he would handle the opening titles for Spider-Man 2, but instead of clips like they did in Superman 2, he went with artwork, which I honestly think that Spider-Man 2 did that significantly better, but I did appreciate the recap sequence that they gave us in Superman 2.
Yes, I did kind of notice a similarity between the two after you pointed that out while we were going over some of the material for this film. And I think the reason for that is because, you see, this is back in the early 70s, if you count the first Superman movie, to the early 80s for this one. And back then, superheroes were kind of just taken off, no pun intended, so to speak. But when Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man came around in the early 2000s, we kind of had more of a grasp, I think, on what superheroes were, what they represented, and just who they were in general, so that he went with a different tactic using art.
Now, to say that Superman 2 had some production issues is a bit of an understatement, given that the first film and the sequel were shot simultaneously by Richard Donner. Superman 2 was 75% finished, and Warner Brothers put a hold on Superman 2 so that they can finish solely on finishing the first one, and wait for the release of Superman and make sure that it was successful enough, and eventually it turned out to be successful. So if it was, then they can resume production on Superman 2. But there was like a lot of disagreements between Richard Donner and the producers. Donner was fired, and Richard Lester came in to replace him. Now, there are certain moments, if you watch the theatrical version in particular, you can tell which scenes were shot by Lester and which certain scenes were done by Richard Donner. When I watched the theatrical, I mean, I do like certain moments in the theatrical, and there's a lot that I love in the Donner cut, in particular the Marlon Brando scenes. And when it comes to the opening, they reshot the hell out of the opening, especially in Paris. After the opening credits, we get the scene where Superman stops a terrorist attack in Paris, and because these terrorists are like threatening to nuke Paris with a hydrogen bomb. And of course, he saves Lois, and then after that, he launches the bomb that's like in an elevator up into space. And while the bomb blows safely into space, there's an unintentional consequence when it comes to that explosion.
Yeah. Apparently, Zod, Ursa, and Non are in the Phantom Zone at the time, pretty much just floating through space until the bomb goes off and sets them free.
Now, how it was originally supposed to be executed is very different compared to how it was going to be handled in the theatrical cut, because how they were freed was because of the hydrogen bomb that Superman tossed into space.
Yeah.
And for Donner's original version, one of the missiles from the first movie that Superman launched into space, which was part of like Lex Luthor's plan to sink California, he hauls the missile into space, and that missile was supposed to free Zod and his cronies from the Phantom Zone, and they would have been released at the very end of the original movie. My guess is they would have done that as kind of like a post-credits scene if they had post-credits in the late 70s, but it would have been like a major cliffhanger if they did decide to do it that way. But I'm okay with what we got in both versions.
Yeah, besides, a lot of times back then, the best thing you can do is just finish the story and then come up with the next one the next time around instead of just leaving things open. This next scene gets pretty interesting in my book. It's right after Zod and his little cronies, so to speak, get released from the Phantom Zone. They realize that they have powers similar to Superman's under the Yellow Sun, just like he did, and they go straight to the moon to kind of look around, I guess you could say, find some astronauts and use their new powers to slaughter them. And after that, they pretty much go to Earth and begin their conquest of the planet.
And when you talk about actors who fit into the mold of a classic comic book villain, Terence Stamp does that to a T when it comes to his performance as General Zod. It's just like the look, the facial hair, his voice, just... He steals like every scene that he's in, and of course the iconic "kneel before Zod."
Yeah, that movie was definitely the first time in my life I think I had ever heard that line, and I think of him every time I hear it these days.
Yeah. So, how do you feel about Terence Stamp's portrayal of Zod?
I think he's spot on, but at the same time, one could argue that Michael Shannon, yes. His performance as Zod is also good in Man of Steel, so I'd say the best way to describe it is that they're both the best representation of Zod in their respective time periods. One essential plot point that I really like about this story is the romance that continues to blossom between Superman and Lois for the majority of this film. It's, I think, greatly expanded upon throughout the course of this film versus the last one, and they pretty much, on that front, started out in this nice little trip that Clark and Lois take as reporters from Perry to go to Niagara Falls.
Superman saves like this dumb kid who's just just hanging on the other side of a railing. I'm just over by the falls. I'm just like, I mean, is this kid have a death wish or something? But regardless, I mean, while Clark is out getting hot dogs for both him and Lois, that's of course like when he eventually changes into Superman, saves the kid, and that's when Lois kind of like is starting to like put two and two together. Is just like Clark's never around when Superman is around.
Yeah, and
You know.
I know it probably seems fairly obvious in that regard, but you also have to understand in the comics as well as certain forms of media, they have found ways to kind of make it so that Clark and Superman appear in the same place at the same time to kind of help hide the secret identity thing. But in this case, I guess the movies do kind of make it a little obvious, but I feel like that's part of the point.
Yeah, and how she finds out that Clark is Superman is pretty clever when he like accidentally like trips and then his hands are like stuck in the fire and she realizes that he doesn't have like any burns or anything like that. He's like, "You're Superman," and of course he admits that. They go to the Fortress of Solitude. That's when their romance blossoms, and I think that both of these movies together just really nailed both Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder's chemistry.
Yeah, honestly, I could feel the love coming off them whenever I watch that movie. It feels about as genuine as it gets. Apparently, the romance between Superman and Lois blossoms so much that Superman wants to basically give up his powers so that he can be with her. Superman asks the hologram of his mom if there's a way that he can do that, and she is willing to give him that, but she also warns him that if he does it, all of his powers on Earth would disappear forever, and Superman doesn't care because he loves her and he really wants to be with her, so he does it anyway. And after he loses his powers, the control panel in the fortress for basically all the crystals blows up and just explodes. And then after Superman steps out of the chamber as Clark, Lois finds him and having overheard everything that just happened and saw with her own eyes, she is like, "You did all that for me?" And he's silent and she goes, "I don't know what to say." And Clark's like, "Just say you love me."
Yeah, it's a very powerful moment. But various like filmmakers like took tidbits from this story, like kind of like how Sam Raimi approached how he wanted the story handled in Spider-Man 2, because in a way, I mean, they're both kind of similar because with Peter and Clark like losing their powers, but Clark gives them up willingly, while Peter like is having difficulty like balancing like both his normal life and his life as Spider-Man. So I would say that Spider-Man 2 handled that story significantly better because I think that he's much more emotional and vulnerable compared to Superman.
But as far as giving powers up willingly versus, like, half heartedly due to a lack of imbalance, while it is interestingly similar, it's also a concept that has pretty much been explored in comics time and time again. So whether or not they took inspiration from each other is kind of unknown in my book, but at the same time, it is a remarkable similarity between the two of them, and yeah, I can kind of see where they might get inspired regardless.
So when Zod and company arrive on Earth, they cause a shit ton of destruction, do a little redecorating, so to speak, on Mount Rushmore, and the Donner Cut, they just only like fuck up the Washington Monument, but that was about it. But they force the president to surrender all authority over to Zod. So their presence, to say, is demanding on screen is an understatement. So after Clark gets up his powers, him and Lois go to a diner. Clark gets his ass handed to him by this one asshole. And that's the moment where he realizes that he made a huge mistake giving up his powers after finding out that Zod and his cronies have invaded Earth. And that's when Zod finds out about Superman from the president, and that's when he publicly challenges Superman to face him.
Yeah, honestly, I'm I'm impressed at Zod's, like, just, I guess you could say, tenacity or arrogance to some degree, because he's like thinking he's got all the cards here, and he's just willingly challenging Superman right off the bat on live TV. But the fact that he realized he made a mistake and wanted to go back and try and fix it, that to me says a lot about his character.
Yeah, and when he goes back to the fortress, I mean, you can see like the look of regret on his face, especially in one shot where he's just calling out to his parents and telling them that he failed, and it looks like all hope is lost until he notices the green crystal glowing. And for many years after he picks it up, it cuts to like Zod and his cronies at the White House, so it like leaves you wondering for a long time, how the hell did he get his powers back? Because, I mean, when we do see Superman again, I mean, he's all ready to go and fight Zod. But that's when it's resolved in the Donner Cut, which I greatly appreciated.
Yeah, and of course we will get to that when we actually review the Donner Cut in general. But I think the overall, like, point of that being left out in the theatrical cut was probably because we already know that the green crystal survived the explosion of the panel because Lois, like, was looking at it when Superman came back to the fortress one day after he took her there and left it in the snow. So it wasn't on the panel when it exploded and survived, which was pretty much all Superman needed in order to somehow get his powers back, which we will, of course, talk about in the Donor Cut.
So, but for the theatrical cut, it's kind of left ambiguous. So I can understand how people can appreciate that in a way.
Yeah, but like I said, we'll go into it more later.
Gene Hackman is, of course, back as Lex Luthor, but his role is a bit minimal in the sequel, but he still has a part to play in the grand scheme of things. Once he escapes from prison with the help of Miss Tessmacher, which I never really got, given the circumstances in the first movie, given that one of the missiles that was directed towards Hackensack, and that was all part of Lex's plan to sink California. She mentioned that her mother lived in Hackensack. He didn't give a shit, but wanted to execute this plan regardless. She saved Superman, and I guess for some reason she somehow remains loyal to Luthor. That's one thing that I never really understood, even as a kid and even now as an adult. I'm like, why the hell are you still loyal to this asshole? After he escapes from prison, he makes his way to the Fortress of Solitude because of this alpha wave device that he's been using to track Superman's movements. He learns about Zod and his cronies, and eventually forms some form of alliance with them when he meets them at the White House, informs them about Superman, and he's more of a side villain compared to Zod and his cronies because they're pretty much the main villains of this movie.
Yeah, and personally, I'm okay with that because, and I don't mean to get too far off topic here, but if I may, I just want to say, I feel like to some degree, and I don't just mean in this film, but I mean in Superman in general, we keep using Lex Luthor so many times, over and over and over again, and it was good back in those days. It's still good to some degree these days, but honestly, I just feel like we've been using him too much, even if they come as a set, because they just have, in my book, I think millions of other villains to choose from, but they always go with Lex, even in this new film.
Well, with him being Superman's arch nemesis, it kind of makes sense.
Of course. It's just, I guess, what I'm saying is I get they come as a set, but you don't always have to use him as the main villain. He could be there in the background, have LexCorp in the background, or have him play a extremely minor role, and then focus on someone else like Zod and his cronies, so to speak. But I guess, it's just kind of hard to do that. But I am glad that they kind of toned him down a little for this film. It shows that they're not always trying to follow the exact same pattern, but I am hoping in later years that we can shake it up a little.
And when Superman eventually returns to fight Zod and his cronies in Metropolis, it does certainly deliver from what audiences wanted for summer blockbusters in the 80s. And to a degree, by today's standards, a large majority of this fight still holds up.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I ever saw that fight, I couldn't believe it. because for me, I don't think I really saw Superman ever fight someone that was really a match for him, or especially with his powers, except maybe in the Superman animated series to some degree. But the thing is, to me, this really was like one of the best fights I could think of to watch in a Superman film. I mean, who wouldn't enjoy it? The idea of four Kryptonians going at it and seeing who would come out on top, that sounded pretty good to me.
Yeah, just like him fighting all three of the Kryptonians while trying to minimize as much damage as possible. While they continue to like cause like more destruction with their powers, but and especially like when it comes to the moment like when the crowd thinks that Superman is dead and they want to go up against them themselves, when the people decide to go up against them themselves, when the three Kryptonians begin using their super breath to cause more damage, that's when Superman makes some sort of a tactical retreat and try to attract them to the Fortress of Solitude so he can try to like minimize more of the destruction while also at the same time getting the home field advantage.
And I know for a fact that sometimes if you come up against someone you know you can't beat, you have to be smart. It's okay to run the other way, especially when you're outnumbered. But in Superman's
That's what you did there in the Flash.
yeah, but it's also a really good piece of advice for people who get into these kind of situations in real life as well. But the point is, even though it seemed like Superman was just running away, I really thought that this was all part of his plan, and I think you guys will all agree with me on that as we talk about this final part of the movie.
How this is executed in the theatrical, I'm kind of like 50-50 about when Superman fights them in the fortress. Like him throwing that cellophane S at Non, I thought was a bit stupid, and them having the ability to teleport, which, I mean, if that happened in early comics, I can understand that, but I mean, I'm not judging the comics, I'm judging the movie. But yeah, I mean, there are certain moments in the theatrical cut I can do without, and those in particular are those that I can do without.
Despite the interesting idea that they had with that confrontation with Zod and his cronies, with all the different abilities, this next part of the movie is, I think, really worth, well, all of it really, because Superman has this plan to trick all of them into going into the same molecule chamber that he went into to lose his powers in the first place. And when Lex tries to stop them from doing that, they tell him to activate the machine himself, which he does. And Superman, being the clever guy that he is at this point, decided to reverse the effect so that all the rays of the red sun of Krypton that took away his powers the first time around are on the outside of the chamber instead of the inside, while he's safe in there. So when he comes out, Zod wants him to kneel and swear eternal loyalty to him, and then he just crushes his hand and like lifts him off the ground like nothing and throws him away. It's just so satisfying.
Yeah, easily one of the most satisfying moments in cinematic history, in my personal opinion, and especially when it comes to comic book movies.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, it's just so satisfying, especially since Lois got to throw a punch at Ursa in this part of the film, which had to be like extremely satisfying for her, considering she tried to do that earlier when she still had powers and it didn't work.
Yeah, and Non trying to fly, and of course he falls into that chasm. So, I mean, I can say that like in terms of the controversial like moment where Zod is essentially killed in this moment, it didn't bother me, and I'm pretty sure I don't know how people reacted back in the early 80s about this compared to like how Zod's death was handled in Man of Steel. But there's two different versions, and there's like a TV version where they survived after getting their powers removed, and the three Kryptonians, along with Luthor, are sent to prison. So, I mean, their fate didn't bother me, so
Me either.
yeah. Another thing that I don't like about the theatrical version with is when Clark erases Lois's memory with a kiss, and I can understand why, is because I mean she's so like emotional and doesn't like know how to like handle being in a relationship with him without like telling anybody that she knows like that Clark is Superman. And I mean, when it comes to Margot Kidder's acting in that scene, I mean, that part I like. I mean, because it really like nails her heartbreak, but the execution of like him erasing Lois's memory with that kiss, I always thought was kind of stupid, and some fans even say that that moment is kind of stupid, but um, uh, that one I'm kind of like 50-50 about. It's mostly like Margot Kidder's acting that kind of like saves that moment for me, but it's just like I could do without the mind erasing kiss. And there's a satisfying moment where Clark gets a bit of payback on that asshole who kicked his ass the first time when he didn't have his powers, and
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely hilarious. I mean, the way that he gets his revenge and pays for the damage, and the excuse that he makes that he's been working out. I mean, because of the everybody in the diner realizing like how ridiculously strong Clark is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Superman 2 is just a satisfying sequel. It has its problems, I will admit that. I mean, is it a perfect movie? No. Is it satisfying to watch? Absolutely. Regardless if you watch the original or the Donner cut. It's just like one of those sequels that's damn near close to being as great as the original movie.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say? Everyone has their opinions about whether a movie is good or bad. There's no real definite answer, but it's basically simple. Do you like Superman? Do you want to check this film out? And would you accept it, flaws and all, for what it is instead of what you want it to be? To me, that is pretty much just how it is with movies in general. Not just about it being what you want it to be, but accepting it for what it is.
So I'm going to give Superman 2 an A minus. So what did you all think of the film? Let me know in the comments below, and I want to give a big thank you to Cameron for collaborating with me on Superman 2.
Of course, bud. Glad to be back.
Yeah, and we'll end up talking about the Richard Donner cut pretty soon, which I'm definitely excited to talk about.
Yeah.
And guys, thank you so much as always for watching. Looking forward to doing more videos really soon. And if you want my thoughts on old or new movies, of course, you know where to find me.